Howdy. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to FrackingSENSE. Not necessarily everyone got the memo, apparently, but we're delighted that those of you, I hear the here they come. So thank you for joining us. It was a very informative experience for me last winter and spring, to have the FrackingSENSE talks, and we are starting up again with FrackingSENSE 2.0. Our co-sponsors for this series are Boulder County and the Boulder County Commissioners. The FrackingSENSE lecture series is part of the big project supported by the National Science Foundation Sustainability Resource Network on oil and gas development and hydraulic fracturing. I want to take just a second to explain the shift between FrackingSENSE 1.0 and 2.0. In FrackingSENSE 1.0, we were confining our speakers much more to the expression of their expertise, helping us understand complicated matters about hydraulic fracturing, natural gas production, and oil production as well. FrackingSENSE 2.0 becomes a little bit more adventurous in that we have now been very explicit in encouraging our speakers to reach conclusions and offer recommendations and prescriptions and visions. No hallucinations, though there can be those. So just kidding. I mean, you could certainly have anything that you would count as a vision. And so we are, in other words, asking our speakers to offer evidence-based findings that will lead them to reach these conclusions and recommendations and prescriptions. They will, as we watch, they will demonstrate how they weigh evidence, evaluate conflicting studies, and appraise contradictory claims. In other words, they will model critical thinking and the reasoned approach to a conclusion with all of that performed live. We will continue to have individuals speaking and not debates or forums or panels. The thinking behind this series is that it is cumulative. You should come to as many as you can. If you miss one, you should watch the recordings, the films on the website, so that the different opinions will accumulate in your mind. It is, I hope, guaranteed for this round, for 2.0, that you will have moments, that anyone in the audience will have moments of thinking, well, I'm not sure I agree with that, which is fine, which is very good. And then take it in, though. Whatever it is that you hear, it will be interesting, it will be stimulating, it will sharpen your thinking. And at some point or another, the person who sat next to you smiling during something you disagreed with, the roles will reverse and we'll have another speaker, and that person will be flinching and you'll be grinning. So it'll just be a delight to see how those roles pass back and forth on that. So again, our hope is that you will learn and find your mind stimulated by this process of reaching conclusions, not that you will be converted or changed or leave a different person. Well, if you do happen to leave as a different person, we'd want to know about that. That would be interesting to hear, but that is by no means our goal. So we'll continue with our written question custom because it allows the audience to ask so many questions and for us to cover them. So within 15 minutes or so of the speaker beginning, there will be people from the center strolling around, and you can just pass them in your folders you'll have, or in your programs you'll have questions. They can get you more of those if you signal that you'd like those. So if you write the questions, then I can get them categorized, and it seems like a very different thing where people ask the questions. Sometimes we only get 5 or 6 questions, and now we can get them all acknowledged and included. So it is my particular pleasure tonight to introduce Matthew Sura, who is an attorney specializing in the representation of landowners, mineral owners, and local governments in their negotiations and legal disputes with oil and gas, with the oil and gas industry. He worked for many years with the Western Colorado Congress, which is where I first met him, and that is a very interesting, very active, and in many cases inspirational place-based group for attending to where they live and thinking hard about the best future for that place. So Matt worked in Garfield County for a number of years, so he knows that scene, which has appeared from time to time in our conversations, and he is now doing a significant amount of work in Weld County, which is a place of great attention, great activity in the oil and gas industry. And if we had written central casting and said, could you get us a person to be in the midst of all these activities and to watch it alertly and acutely and reflectively, I'm not sure central casting could have done much better for us. So getting you here to talk about what you have seen, what you draw from your experiences, and what you would recommend for us to have on our minds as we think about this whole subject. So ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Matthew Sura.
Thanks so much. I want to thank my friends and family for rounding out the house, and hopefully we'll have a good time together. Some of what I'm going to be describing is really just based on personal experience rather than my, really researching into this science. Certainly I have had come across scientific studies, but I've done so as an activist first in working to protect places that I cared about and communities that I cared about and were working with, specifically Garfield County and now Greeley, Colorado. So I bring to be really upfront and blunt, I bring that bias with me when I look at research. However, I think that the case that I'm going to make is hopefully convincing to all of you. Planning for 1,600 wells in Greeley, Colorado. Case for applying local zoning to the oil and gas industry. Again, I was director of Western Colorado Congress. I worked with Western Colorado Congress for over 12 years, and I graduated from CU Law School, and I am now an oil and gas attorney. So I'm working, with a lot of clients to benefit from the oil and gas industry. I'm also working with a lot of communities who don't see the oil and gas industry as a huge benefit, and therefore they're trying to prevent, some of what the oil and gas industry is trying to accomplish in their community. Just to give you an outline of the presentation, I'm going to start from when I was a young whippersnapper back in Garfield County, brand new community organizer, a little bit background on state preemption, and then talking a little bit about what we've seen just recently with the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, some of their decisions and rulemaking that really draws some of the leadership that we're getting from the state into question. So, Piceance Basin is over here. And that's Garfield County, Mesa County, a number of Rio Blanco is in there. And for the most part, it's a tight sands formation at this point, natural gas. And tight sands formation means that you've got little pockets of gas that are located throughout the strata, a sandstone strata, and they're able to access that through drilling down into that sandstone and fracking it, and hydraulically fracturing it. So they were doing a lot of hydraulic fracturing for the last 20 years over the Piceance Basin. Of course, we're here in the Denver-Julesburg Basin. We're going to get to talking about that soon. As was mentioned, Western Colorado Congress is a place-based organization, and I have been involved with Western Colorado Congress since 1996. And these are a number of the community groups that we had from San Miguel County all the way to Routt County. Period of my time in Western Colorado Congress and as a community organizer, that's how I started there, was really interesting. It was a time of a lot of oil and gas development, particularly in Garfield County and in the Piceance Basin, and we were right in the middle of it. And as you can see in this slide, we've got nearly doubling of the number of permits that were given out every other year. And it just, it was a stair step like that for most of the time that I was there. I want to talk a little bit about Garfield County, and this is a beleaguered county from oil and gas development. This is an interesting idea that they had back in 1969. It was they're looking for, it was a plowshares program, and they're looking for peaceful means to use some of the nuclear technology that they had. And they came up with this clever and ingenious plan, so said the state agency at the time, to use a nuclear bomb to detonate and hydraulic fracture the sandstone, and then therefore getting some of the gas to come to the surface. And as you can imagine, they maybe didn't think it out entirely right. There's a few problems with that plan. One, what do you expect happened to the natural gas? What kind of gas was it? Well, it was radioactive. And not only that, but it didn't fracture. There is so much heat generated from a nuclear bomb that it actually formed a light bulb out of that sandstone formation. So it just turned that sandstone into glass. And so there's a glass light bulb under Rulison right now filled with radioactive gas. And It's not a place that they even allow drilling at this point. The other questionable decisions that were coming from the federal government in this case, and not the state government that was also clever and ingenious, was to turn oil shale into oil. Problem with oil shale is that it's really young, hasn't really been underground long enough to turn into true oil. And so the way to speed up that geologic process that usually takes millions of years, they have to heat it into this incredibly high temperature to have that oil, or kerogen in this case, bleed out of it. And then they have to do a lot to fix that oil. Extremely energy intensive. It actually takes more energy than they produce. And in 1983, they were going and blowing, and they had many different companies that were producing this oil shale. And then suddenly they all decided, 1983, they're just going to turn off the lights and go home. And it was absolutely devastating to Garfield County and devastating to Mesa County. So they've seen their hardships with the oil and gas industry before I got there. But this is Roan Plateau area, and we're going to be looking at these boxes. So this is 1989, and not a lot of activity there that you can see. And in 2000, you can see that you're starting to get these pock marks, and each one of these pock marks is a well pad and the attendant oil and gas facilities and possibly a waste pit. And then in 2004, you can see that you can see the waste pits there, and it really starts looking completely different. So this is 15 years. What happened to that landscape? And when I got there in 1996, 97, they had just experienced going from one well per 320 acres. And that's, you're going to be able to deal with that because it's a rural area, and you can see the well out in the fields, and that's not a problem for anybody. And then it went to one well per 180. And then suddenly, within a short span of 6 years, they went to one well per 80, then to 40, to 20, and then finally to 10. One well every 10 acres. And they're all individual vertical wells, and they all look like this. And this is a 10-acre spacing right next to the Colorado River, there next to Parachute. You can imagine how that was changing not only the landscape, but the people that live on the landscape and call that place home. So I'm just a brand new organizer, and I know the characteristics of a good issue. I know the characteristics of a good issue include that it needs to be a regional issue. Well, and this oil and gas development is taking over the entire area, particularly in that western Garfield County, and so that's a check mark. It needs to be strongly felt. Well, a lot of these wells are going into people's land, into their back 40, and they don't own mineral rights, and they don't even want the oil and gas well there. And it is strongly felt because it's actually hurting their ability to make a living on that land. So that's a check. Addressing people's self-interest, again, it's timely. It was happening so fast, and the oil and gas development was happening so quick that nobody felt like we could stop it. We had to do something immediately. And another characteristic of a good issue is whether or not you have enough resources and it's winnable. And the way we were looking at it is that, look, we got 5 out of 7. Let's just go for it. Let's take this on. So we took on the oil and gas industry. And this is a little bit of what we saw. This is the impacts of the oil and gas development on Garfield County: surface, water, air, and health. And the surface impacts I'm going to talk about primarily are property rights and impacts to the land. So if a complete stranger comes up to you and says, look, I'm going to build a well pad there. I'm going to clear away about 5 acres of land on your property, and I'm going to have some polluting industry there, and I'm going to be visiting that area. Well, for the first month, it's going to be absolutely tremendously noisy, so noisy that we might even just move you out, and give you a place to stay at the local motel. But after that, we're going to be visiting there, once a week, and taking product out of that area that's toxic. And you say, what? What do you mean? Well, that's what's happening all the time. If you don't own the mineral rights, or those mineral rights have been leased, prior to your being there, The oil and gas industry has the right to go and build a well pad more or less where they choose in some cases, and there's not a lot that you can do about it. You have to learn how to cope and to live with it. You know, they do throw you $2,500 for your troubles. Now it's a lot more than that, but that's what they were giving people for a well in Garfield County when I first showed up. Is it a home on the range or an industrial site? And that's kind of what I want you to think about. Is it some of the impacts that I'm showing you here, is it something that is compatible with a residential area? Or is it more like an industrial area and possibly should belong in, you know, some open space or even an industrial area within cities and counties? There's going to be pipeline corridors. There's going to be scars on the landscape. Again, you know, 5 to 7 acres easily per well. There's going to be impacts to water quality. Now, the biggest impact to water quality is not hydraulic fracturing. It is what you're seeing here. It's sediment. It's sediment loading in the rivers and streams in the area. But there is hydraulic fracturing, and they're using a tremendous number of chemicals and fluids, about 5 million gallons per well. And you know, we can debate back and forth whether or not that's something that you want to drink. I wouldn't, because the stuff that the governor was drinking is not available commercially. The stuff that is being used here in Colorado is all contains some toxic chemicals. This is an example of a horizontal well, and you're going to get much more detailed analysis of what hydraulic fracturing is, and you've probably already seen that. But again, it's going down in this area, it's going down about a mile, and then going out a mile or 2 miles, and doing these stage fracturing to release some of the natural gas and oil that's caught up in that formation, that shale formation. There are spills. Obviously, that's going to be an impact to water quality, both groundwater and it can be surface water. There's about an average of 1 spill a day in the state of Colorado, of varying sizes. Waste pits, eventually they all leak. And fortunately, both the state government as well as the industry themselves are moving away from waste pits, and that's a good news for all of us. And then there's the extremely controversial claim that if you have a water well that is located near oil and gas facilities, it's more likely to end up with oil and gas contamination. And you wouldn't think that would be that controversial, but it is. In fact, Stephen Osborne took a lot of flack for saying just that in his study, the Duke study. And this is how this works. This is some pictures that I took over in Garfield County. It's a place called Divide Creek, and it was the Divide Creek Seep. This is an area that is just above Rulison and Rifle area, if you're familiar with the I-70 corridor in Garfield County. So this guy, Steve Thompson is a barrel-chested guy, and he's got a long white beard, and he's always wearing overalls, at least every time I saw him. And Steve was walking on his back 40, and he notices in Divide Creek that it's just bubbling like a boiling cauldron, just bubbling. And so, you know, you asked me about science experiments. This is a science experiment my friend Steve did. He decided to light it. Decided to see what would happen if you put a match down there. Now, I wouldn't have done that. That doesn't seem like a great idea. And yet, his hypothesis was proved that it is indeed methane coming out of the water. And what happened, going to give you kind of a quick explanation of how something like that would happen. So this is a good well that has good integrity. So here you've got a casing, and the target producing zone is here, and you're producing from that target zone, and it's all being kept in the pipeline where it should be. And there's another shallow producing zone that doesn't produce as much as you'd like, so you're not going to produce that. And you have to make sure that the casing and cement is clearly keeping that out of production. But what can happen is if you don't have really good cement job, you can get some channelization in that cement that then allows it to go up outside of that casing and then to the braiding head, and then it comes out and ends up going into the freshwater aquifer. Another way that it can happen is if you you have incomplete cement. And this is exactly what happened in the case of Divide Creek. They didn't cement all the way. There was a shallow producing zone that didn't get any cement whatsoever, and that shallow producing zone produced as much as it could into Divide Creek, and also, unfortunately, into 3 homes' water wells that the industry then purchased, and they lost their homes. And it's not only just individual homeowners that can be affected, it can be whole communities. Here's a case of Palisade, right next to Grand Junction, where this is their watershed, all this area here. The BLM leased all this land in one lease sale in 2006. And as you can imagine, City of Palisade, who doesn't even allow cows to graze in this area, said, really, this is not appropriate. We can't allow this to happen. Some of the land was actually in the City of Grand Junction's watershed as well. So the citizens took up petitions and carried ballots for about a month and a half, and even in a very conservative area, Grand Junction, Colorado, we were able to collect over 4,500 signatures in a month and a half. And this is maybe unfair, but we were at one point at a farmer's market, and we were giving away water that had information about our concerns, and a skull and crossbones on the side, to make the point that you don't want to contaminate your water supply. And we were proposing, not anything that you would think is very controversial. We wanted a baseline of what the water quality was before they came. We wanted to prohibit toxic chemicals from coming into the watershed at all, providing a list of best management practices that they would want to impose to make sure that the water quality wasn't contaminated. A bond, in case there was a problem, we would be able to fix it. Hiring additional third-party monitors and making sure that ultimately there was no measurable increase in pollution in the water supply. And we had some help. Honestly, it was one of the best times I ever had as a community organizer, because I was able to work with the Catholic Church. And in one sermon at the biggest Catholic church in Grand Junction, the father said to the entire congregation that it is our duty to protect God's resources, the resources on the planet, particularly our water quality. And by the way, there's a petition just outside, and I expect everybody's going to want to sign it when they leave. And you can imagine, all of a sudden, 450 people pouring out, all wanting to sign my petition. I was overwhelmed, and it was truly a movement and a lot of fun. And Fran Didier, also from that Catholic church, single-handedly was responsible for 500 petition signatures. And if you've ever done any of that, it's really hard work, and not something that I'd recommend. So you can understand that I will always love Fran. I've got a very soft spot in my heart for her. So impacts to air quality and health. We can get into the local impacts, regional impacts, and then there's global impacts. Clearly, oil and gas development has implications on climate change. Dust and emissions from heavy traffic is probably the one that you notice first and foremost. There's also going to be heavy truck traffic, that are belching fumes and smoke. Compressor engines, a big source, condensate tanks, glycol dehydrators. In a typical site, you might have several sources. This being a condensate tank, and we've got a couple emission sources there as well. Probably, some sort of burner of some sort. Industrial accidents, that's another source. It's not always, there's a reason why we put industrial areas away from residential areas, is because sometimes they're very dangerous. They're dangerous workplaces. They can be dangerous to the people living there. Nearby, they can be dangerous to the people working there. And in this case, like any industry, you can't be too careful. Sometimes you're going to have accidents. And this is an event where they had this condensate just spewing out of this and piling up like snow all over the ground. And it was so volatile that you could make a snowball out of it, and it was kind of a waxy substance. But within 2 hours, it all evaporated. It was all part of into the atmosphere. And then there's a well blowout near Windsor, Colorado. You probably heard about that. That was just in February. And then there's other experiments that the state had done. And this is something that the state was allowing. They said that at the time, a number of companies didn't want to have to haul all the produced water, because a lot of produced water comes out of oil and gas, and they have to put it into a big, either a tank or in a big pit, and then eventually haul it out and dispose of it. And what one operator decided to do is say, hey, we're doing a lot of flaring when we first produce these. Why don't we just turn the flare onto the produced water and evaporate it quickly? And I was talking to the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission director at the time, and he said, well, that's a clever and ingenious idea, isn't it? Well, I don't know. It seems to me that we don't really know what's in that water, and it could cause some problems. And what ended up happening over and over again is that we've got these waste pit fires, and they would be just huge belching smoke that would come up, big columns of smoke on the horizon. And it happened enough that they decided that wasn't maybe an ingenious, clever idea. There's going to be increased health risks if you're living next to oil and gas facilities, because methane, it carries with it, which is natural gas. Most of natural gas is methane, but it's also going to contain benzene and some other carcinogenic chemicals that we know can cause some problems. And this is something that was done in Garfield County. The Sacramento Institute did this on behalf of Garfield County and came up with the fact that over a lifetime you can expect to double your cancer risk if you're living next to some of these condensate tanks. And your cancer risk isn't that high, but doubling it seems like a lot to a lot of us, particularly those that are living next to a number of condensate tanks. And so obviously some people had some real concerns about that, and the EPA suggests that 1% over a lifetime is the goal, and doubling from 7.8 to say 27.2% is a big jump. There are also were continuous studies. After that study, Garfield County decided to fund another study that was actually done by Colorado School of Public Health, Lisa McKenzie, and it was a health impact assessment. And out of that health impact assessment, she found that there is an increased risk, a health risk, for anyone living within a half mile of oil and gas facility, an oil and gas well. And as you can imagine, that really stirred up the community as well. But again, you're talking about oil and gas industry. We know that there's going to be additional health risk because they're dealing with carcinogenic and toxic chemicals. So again, it was extremely controversial, and I think it's more or less like the Osborne's water quality study, more or less common sense. Theo Colburn just did a study in the past year that found when she was looking in Garfield County, all these chemicals were coming from the oil and gas well. And shockingly, all these chemicals are from the natural gas itself, rather than any fracking chemicals that were put into there. We're all have been kind of programmed to fear fracking and hydraulic fracturing, and that's what we should be concerned about. But she proved that really the bigger concern is what's actually coming out of the ground. And these are the types of health categories that all those chemicals can cause: skin and eye and sensory organ irritation, immune system, brain and nervous system, etc. And moving on to more regional impacts, we've got ground level ozone, and we're all living in a non-attainment area in ground level ozone. Ground level ozone is really a combination of VOCs, volatile organic compounds, NOx, the nitrogen oxides, and sunlight, combining to create O3, which is dangerous to human lungs. And this is the non-attainment area. Greeley is in it, so is Boulder. This is just the most recent information from the state, indicating, the yellow indicates every time that there was reading, an 8-hour reading. It has to be continuously 8-hour average that is over the mandate by the Environmental Protection Agency. And as you can see, we had a lot of them in the Front Range this year. In fact, it was a very high ozone year for us. And it has been since, frankly, since John Hickenlooper took office. Since 2010, we've been steadily doing more and more drilling in Weld County area, and we have steadily more and more ozone, higher ozone readings, and have since our average ozone reading is over the federal limit. Where is this coming from? Well, the state itself in 2010 projected that it was about 50% were coming from the oil and gas industry in the non-attainment area. And since then, there's been other projections that show 55% and possibly as high as 70% in certain counties in the non-attainment area. So this is also the NOx, and NOx is not the number one coming from the oil and gas industry. It's number 3. It's 21% is coming from the oil and gas industry. And again, so we've got the oil and gas industry on its own giving us all we need really to create ground level ozone that's dangerous for kids, for old people, for anybody with problems breathing at all, you know, whether they have asthma. Those folks are definitely at risk. And high ozone days, those folks that have asthma know about it and are looking for it and are making sure that they're not going outside during those days. A lot of people die every year. It's estimated that 5,000 people a year die because of high ozone. So, you know, that's all well and good. You know, we're all dealing with high ozone. The oil and gas industry, you know, is contributing most of it, but we all, you know, are also contributing to it, and we are all doing something about it, though. And in fact, you know, everybody here who drives has a vehicle that had to go through an emissions inspection, you know, and so you're paying money to make sure that that car is running cleanly. Well, there are a lot of us that believe that the oil and gas industry should be doing the same thing, should be paying to make sure that they're running cleanly, that there are inspections in place and that they're using the best available technologies to make sure that they're not polluting our atmosphere. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Niobrara and the Jake well. The Jake well was in 2009. It was a big boom. It was what started the big boom on the Front Range. In October of 2009, it came in, and it came in so big that it caused a stir among international oil and gas organizations. And 1,750 barrels of oil per day for the first few days, and averaging then 50,000 barrels over the first 90 days. It paid for itself in 3 months. And this is a well that costs $5 million to drill, and it paid for itself in 3 months. So you can imagine that there was going to be a flurry of activity in our area. Fortunately or unfortunately, the Jake well, you know, was an anomaly. There are still some really big producers, but certainly they're not all Jake wells. But this is the type of headlines that we were all, you know, seeing at the time. Anadarko estimates 1.5 billion barrels of oil on the Front Range. And that may have been for their shareholders, or it may have been the reality. They see that they're going to be doing a lot of drilling in this area. And they have. Over the last few years, there's been an average of 2,000 wells drilled in Weld County alone every year. I want to get into a little bit of the state versus local control. The argument for state control is that the Oil and Gas Commission has expertise and experience in a highly technical area, and then we really have to leave it to the experts to make sure that the oil and gas industry is regulated. And we have to have uniformity, because, you know, the oil and gas industry needs to be able to do the same thing in Weld County as it does in Boulder County. And then the argument for local control is that we've got land use conflicts that couldn't be more divisive. We've got someone that owns the surface that expects to be able to use that surface as they like, and then someone that owns the mineral rights under that surface that are expecting to be able to access those minerals through that same land. And those kind of divisive battles, they absolutely need to be dealt with at a local level. Local government should be part of monitoring the industry. And we've been giving the oil and gas industry, the Oil and Gas Commission, that is, more monitors, inspectors every year. And the fact is that they're never going to have enough because we've got 51,000 wells in the state. And so even at 25 inspectors, you're still looking at monitoring every well, maybe once every 4 years. And the local process gives local communities more of an opportunity for input. And that's critical as well. Because if something is being taken from you, your land, or your favorite place to hike, or the community that you knew, or your peace and quiet, you want to have the ability to address that. You want to be able to talk to somebody about that decision. And right now, all those decisions are being made in Denver by the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. And you really don't have the opportunity for any input. And then ultimately, zoning is a local government power. Every other industry in Colorado is subject to zoning. And the oil and gas industry will say, well, we are a completely different industry because, the oil and gas is located where it is, and we can't just move our shop somewhere else. Well, so what I would say to that is the fact that they are directionally drilling, horizontally drilling up to 2 miles. They can reach those resources in most cases, from other locations. And the other thing that I would say is that, well, the mining industry is subject to zoning. We don't have, God forbid, we don't have, coal mines right in the middle of cities, or we don't have uranium mines in the middle of playgrounds. And yet the oil and gas industry believes that they shouldn't be subject to zoning at all. Governor Hickenlooper agrees. He says that to not allow oil and gas unfettered access anywhere they want in the state to this resource would be a taking. It's a taking from our own citizens, and that it can all be done safely. And he promised that any local government that decides that they're going to ban oil and gas development, or in this case hydraulic fracturing, he's going to sue them. And in fact, he has. He's sued the city of Longmont twice over what they're trying to do in that area. They've got 2 suits. One is because they decided to use zoning, and they decided to say, well, we're going to allow oil and gas development, but only in industrial areas and not in our residential areas. And that was considered so stunning and alarming to the oil and gas industry and to the state that they sued them. And then there was a subsequent lawsuit over the ban that came later by the Citizen Initiative. I want to talk a little bit about local moratoria and bans that are happening right now, because his threat apparently didn't carry a lot of weight, because no less than 5 different communities are now looking at moratoria and bans. And you'd say, well, moratoria is different than a ban. It's more or less banning it for a limited time. Well, these moratoria are different. All of the moratoria, except for the one in Boulder, I believe, all of the moratoria more or less say that we are going to ban this activity until such a time, 3 years, and then you have the ability to put something on the ballot to unban this activity. So really, the oil and gas industry would have to bring a citizen initiative to be able to overturn the moratorium. It's an effective ban. And so you can see what's happening in Fort Collins, Loveland. You've got a 2-year moratorium. Boulder is a 5-year moratorium. Lafayette is actually banning hydraulic fracturing, and Broomfield is looking at a 5-year moratorium. A tremendous amount of effort went in by citizens doing that same sort of citizen initiative, collecting signatures that I talked about earlier. This is where we live, Boulder. And my friend Wendy Hybe lives there. And can you imagine what that is? What do you think? It's Greeley. It's the one place that there is an oil and gas development. Every one of these red dots is an oil and gas well. And the only place that has been spared over the last 50, 60 years is actually within the city limits of Greeley. But no more. We've got a lot of new small upstart oil and gas corporations that see this as an opportunity. They see the fact that the majors were leaving the city of Greeley in the city limits alone as an opportunity to spring on. In fact, if you read their memos to their shareholders, they talk about the fact that we are going where the big major oil and gas operators won't go, inside municipalities. And so suddenly you're looking at Anadarko and Noble with different eyes. It's like, wow, I had no idea that those were the good guys, and that there's somebody much, much worse that is now going to be springing in and going into our city parks, any open spaces that they can find within the city of Greeley. As you can see here, these are the laterals, the horizontal wells, and this empty space, with some call the donut hole, is being filled in slowly but surely. In fact, it's not really even a donut hole, is it? It's more like a bullseye. It's a target, and that's where they're going for. Because as you can see from before, it's certainly in the sweet spot. There's a reason that there's all these wells in this area. It's because it's very productive. And so over the last 6 months, there's been some activity by the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. In fact, they have approved 202 new wells within the city limits of Greeley. Where are these new wells? Well, here's one that's called Kelly Farms Northridge. It's called Northridge because it's right next to Northridge High School. In fact, this is the Northridge High School track. And so Boulder teams, when they're coming to visit, you might want to consider, I don't know, gas mask, a little oxygen, before you get there, so you feel a little bit better, because rounding this corner might be a little tricky. Got the Midtown directional location. It's called Midtown because it's downtown Greeley. This is the location, and these are our apartment complexes. Here's a better shot. This is all the condensate tanks that are going to be needed for the 37 wells that they've already approved. The Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission has already approved this. And these are the 37 wells. These are the separators. And these are the building units. 350 feet away. And then we've got the mineral resources. This is an interesting one. 67 wells in this one location. That would be a new record for the state of Colorado. 67 wells on one well pad. Already approved. The same day that that other one, the Midtown, was approved. And what's this? Well, that's a playground, because this is an elementary school. Playground is 300 feet away. The elementary school is 600 feet away from a new record number of wells. And what it looks like. Got the playground here, and these are all the wells, 67, all the condensate tanks and separator. And you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, you said that's only going to be 600 feet away. I remember reading somewhere that there's new setback regulations, and they require them to be 1,000 feet from a school. And you're right, they should have, they didn't. When I went through setback regulations, I was part of rulemaking and representing some conservation clients and Western Colorado Congress during that. And this is the original setback, is 150 feet. Why is it 150 feet? Well, these derricks are usually about 100 feet tall. And so in the event that it was to fall over, if it's 150 feet away, it won't actually crush a home. And that was considered a good hard number to really be able to frame an argument around, or frame a regulation around. But it didn't, of course, take into account any of these different impacts from the oil and gas industry. So we did get some setbacks, and we thought that this was going to be an opportunity to really address this issue of drilling within municipal areas or in residential areas or near homes and schools. And on the surface, it looks like they accomplished something. We've got schools and hospitals are 1,000 feet. Urban setbacks are going to be 500 feet. And in the rural areas, it also has to be 500 feet away from a home. However, we've got exceptions variances and loopholes. Oh my! This is just chock full of exceptions for the oil and gas industry. It was actually written by the oil and gas industry. And there was really nothing we could do about it. I was involved in about 10 hours worth of negotiations over a period of 3 days. And we were making real progress. And then suddenly the oil and gas industry heard from their lobbyists, or they heard from somebody, and they said they were done. We're not negotiating anymore. We don't believe we need to. And they wrote the regulations, and it was obvious that they were writing them because they submitted a document. This is what we'd like the regulations to look like, and it was, you know, publicly submitted. And then publicly, the oil and gas industry rewrote the regulations to look exactly like their document. So it wasn't mysterious. The oil and gas industry wrote the setback regulations. And this is the loopholes. The non-urban area exception, spanning existing locations, surface use agreements. If they have a surface use agreement, they are accepted, and they can also go for a variance at any time. This is the non-urban mitigation zone location exception. The director is directed to give an exception if the oil and gas industry puts forward a proposal that they claim will mitigate some of the impacts of going, you know, closer than, in this case, 500 feet. And the requirements is that they have to do those that are economically practicable. They have to put forward mitigations that are economically practicable. And how you define that is defined by the industry. So if you have a small oil and gas operator, they're going to have the ability to do much less than a much larger organization. And that doesn't seem like a very high standard. And then they also allow for existing locations to be expanded from 1 well or 2 wells to as many wells, possibly even 67, the new record. And what's the problem with this? Well, the problem is that we are building a lot of subdivisions in the middle of the oil and gas fields. And so this is an example of a subdivision that has, is completely surrounded and inundated by oil and gas wells. And many of them are much, much closer than 500 feet. In fact, as close as, in one case, 150 feet.
What Boulder is that?
That is located in somewhere in Boulder County, and I don't know the exact location. Zoning is not a takings. A takings, just to be an attorney for a minute, for my parents' benefit, must be a complete taking. Government must restrict the uses that, but the government has the ability to restrict uses that are considered nuisances. And if there is not a complete taking, you can look at the character of the government action, the economic impact, and the inference with reasonable investment back to expectations. Essentially meaning that if the oil and gas industry expects that they're going to be able to drill within a municipality or on a playground, and they've seen that that has been, you know, something that has been ongoing in the state of Colorado, then it does become a takings. But if we as a citizenry decide that, look, Greeley is a donut hole because we haven't allowed that in the past. We don't allow oil and gas development within our municipalities, and we're not going to, then it's not a takings. And really, we're at the cusp of deciding the future of not only Greeley, but any other place that they find oil and gas. It could be Longmont, it could be Erie, probably not Boulder, because of the geology, and that's the only reason. It just so happens that we're lucky and we don't have geology that would facilitate a lot of oil and gas development. Maybe a little bit on the eastern side. Voss and Lundvall Brothers is thrown out quite a bit. It's the preemption doctrine that is thrown around all the time. It happened in 1993 that the state Supreme Court overturned Greeley's effort at banning oil and gas development within the municipality. Yes, the same Greeley. But they stated that Greeley could regulate oil and gas so long as the local regulations are not in operational conflict with state regulations. So what is operational conflict? It was defined in both Voss and Bowen Edwards. It was the same day. It was released the same day. An operational conflict occurs when this specific local regulation materially impedes or destroys the state interest. So operational conflict doesn't mean that it's just that we have a state regulation that happens to say something different than the local regulation, and they conflict. That's what you and I, would think about as an operational conflict, and that's not it at all. An operational conflict is when a specific local regulation has to materially impede or destroy the state interest. So what is the state interest? At the time of the Voss case, it was written in legislation to foster, encourage, and promote the development, production, and utilization of the natural resources. And this is my favorite part. To protect the public and the private interest against the evils of waste. And you and I think, all right, I'm against waste. It's wasting the resource if you leave it in the ground. So protecting against the evils of waste mean get it all as quickly as you can. And of course the state Supreme Court looked at this and they said, well, the state interest is pretty clear. It's get it all, get it now. However, that has changed. And now we have a dual mandate in this same statute. It's now fostering the responsible, balanced development, production, utilization of the natural resources in the state of Colorado in a manner that is consistent with public health, safety, and welfare, including protection of the environment and wildlife. And that dual mandate is sometimes considered pretty weak. But in fact, if you look at that mandate during the time of Voss, it's much better. And in fact, I think it provides cover for places like Longmont, Boulder, Loveland, all these other places to be able to pass ordinances to either ban oil and gas development within their area, or at least to take a moratorium, a break, to ensure that there are good regulations in place. In summary, the oil and gas industry is an industrial use, and I hope that you've seen that that is the case, that local government is in a better position to address that industrial use in the conflict that is inherent between a surface estate and a mineral estate, and that the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission has really fallen down on the job in protecting our interests, the public's interest, that isn't the oil and gas industry. And that local government does have the ability and should treat the oil and gas industry like any other industry and subject it to local zoning.
Great. Thank you. Okay, I shall go through a couple of questions here that are clarifying particular points that you've raised. One of them on methane gas migration. Is there a specific case in which methane was transported along the well casing and was measured and observed, and the question involves from shallow production zones? So is there a specific case in which from a shallow production zone methane was transported along the well casing and that was measured or observed, and if so, what was it? Just curious. Thanks.
Sure. Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, not only Divide Creek, because that is exactly what happened in Divide Creek Seep, is it was a shallow production zone. They didn't case all the way down, and that shallow production zone started producing right into the space, the annulus next to the casing, went up to the Braden Head, and then leaked out the side, just like that picture showed you, and into local aquifers, and into Divide Creek Seep. Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission has let us know that they've looked through the files and they found 37 different instances where the oil and gas industry was responsible for thermogenic methane, that is methane that is from deep within the ground, not the biogenic methane that is like swamp gas. And sometimes that gets confused by folks. Just because you have a flame shooting out of your faucet doesn't mean that the oil and gas industry has contaminated you. Sometimes that can actually be naturally occurring from biogenic sources. But thermogenic sources, they've documented 37 instances within the state of Colorado.
Okay. On ordinances, there's considerable curiosity about what happened with the petition at Palisade, the one that you showed us where the woman had been remarkable in getting so many things. So what happened with that petition, and how are those ordinances in Palisades and Grand Junction working out?
Yeah, thanks for that. It worked out really well. And in fact, the reason that we decided that we had to go to the ballot and use our power of citizen initiative as our home rule city was because we had gone to them just previously the year before and were shot down by the city council. Very conservative area, Grand Junction. Mesa County generally is extremely conservative. So they said, no, we trust the oil and gas industry will drill responsibly within our watershed, and we don't want any safeguards. So we decided that that was an issue that we needed to take to the citizens, and we did. And we did media more or less every week, and with stunts like the one that I showed you on the front page of the paper there. And by the time we actually had gotten the 4,500 signatures, all the city council had changed their minds, and they had the opportunity to just adopt our ordinance, and they did so. We didn't have to go to the ballot. It was adopted unanimously. And today it is still doing its job, and they have some really progressive standards there in Grand Junction, albeit they didn't ban it. We should have, but it just required kind of best available technologies to be utilized in the watershed.
How does the 10-acre spacing, what was that about if wells go radially up to a mile?
Yeah, great question. So they have only been doing that horizontal drilling for the last, say, 5 years. Those vertical wells were the way that they did it. And in fact, this just goes to show that the oil and gas industry is always, in my experience, reluctant to change. But when they do change, they do it really well, and they end up making tons of money, with the new regulations. And this is an example. Garfield County was such a mess because of this tight sands formation. They had to drill that many wells. They started saying, look, there's this new directional drilling. It wasn't actually horizontal. It was more kind of a slant drilling at the time. Why don't you just do 40-acre spacing and have 4 wells going off there if you need to do the 10 acres? And so that way it would be less impactful on the property, and you'd be able to reclaim that land much more easily, and you'd be able to facilitate having all your facilities consolidated on that well pad, that one well pad. And they fought us tooth and nail all the way through the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. We finally got that in place, and the very next year they were gloating about how much money it was saving them by doing that very thing that they had been forced to do because of the less reclamation and consolidation and all the efficiencies that come with that.
Pretty specific question here. Currently, Bradenhead gas is being vetted by multiple operators in the Man Creek area. Has anyone done an air study to determine the volume of methane being emitted? Has anyone looked at the health impacts from the gas that is being emitted? What's your thought on Bradenhead gas continuous emissions? Quotation marks around continuous. Is it just methane? Boy, you're going to have to help me with this one, because is it just methane, or can BTX be present? Should they flare BH or Bradenhead gases?
Yes.
Well, you'll speak to us a little bit on the terms there.
Okay, so what they're asking for, in Mam Creek is the area that within Garfield County, and it is where a lot of the oil and gas development was happening. Probably nearly 40% of the oil and gas activity was happening in the decade that I was working there. It was happening in that one county. They went from literally like a few hundred wells to now over 12,000 wells in Garfield County in that period. So we saw a lot of oil and gas development. What the question is asking whether there should be any venting whatsoever, and the answer is there should not be. And in fact, I've got cards. A quick postcard to Governor Hickenlooper about some of the air quality regulations that are going to be worked on in February of next year, where they're looking at just this issue of whether or not we should allow just raw methane and all those other BTECs, benzene, toluene, ethylene, xylene, just being vented into the atmosphere. They absolutely should not be. Certainly they're toxic, they're carcinogenic, and more than that, they're greenhouse gas. Methane is 20 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a methane, as a greenhouse gas. we should certainly be trying to capture that and put it into the pipeline. And if you can't do that, the very least you should do is subject it to incinerator, and not just flaring, but incinerating to make sure that all those BTECs that are sometimes harder to burn are destroyed.
Based on the Garfield County casing mishaps, is well casing engineering now regulated in a uniform way? Are there, for instance, specific specific construction materials and standards? And okay, so there.
Yeah, and absolutely that's true. That is an area that the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission has taken on, in large part due to what happened in Divide Creek and other places. They now do have to do better casing and more complete casing and be able to prove that through bond logs and some other mechanisms. And there's still going to be problems. You know, there are still going to be issues. And cement, as you know, anybody that's walked down a sidewalk that has a crack on it, you know that it is also an imperfect, barrier. And ultimately, it will start cracking and it will, have some problems. But they are doing a much better job, and the regulations have improved.
Refresh us on who makes up the COGCC. That's what many C's. Anyway, COGCC. Okay.
That's 2 C's.
Okay, got it.
It's 9 folks, and this is going to be hard, but the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission was really reformed in 2006 through legislation that was really spearheaded by Governor Ritter. He did a phenomenal job in passing really good, robust legislation and then rules. We weren't able to deal with a lot of the setbacks issues at the time and some of the other things that I wish we had, like riparian setbacks from our floodways, but dealt with a lot of issues at the time. What was the question?
Refresh us on who makes it up.
Yeah, so the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission was also reformed at the time, and before that it was 7 members, and 5 of which had to be working or have substantial experience in the oil and gas industry. Substantial experience in the oil and gas industry means that they were more or less industry officials that were sitting and regulating themselves. And many of us felt that that was the fox guarding the hen house. We were able to reform that, and now there are only 2 people that have substantial experience in the oil and gas industry. There's one that's a local government person, there's one that has reclamation experience, one that has to have livestock or range and be a mineral owner. There also needs to be, so there's 9, and then there's the head of the Department of Natural Resources and the head of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And so it is has more rounded out. It's a better body, a better decision-making body at this point. However, it can still be stacked. It can still, we saw what happened during the setbacks. That very balanced body decided to just follow Governor Hickenlooper's lead and pass some regulations that really provided absolutely no protection for people in the gas patch.
This is on economic practicability. Why can't regulations define economically practicable and provide a formula, cost indices, etc.?
Yeah, get you on the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. That's exactly the question we were asking, and it absolutely could have been done and should have been done and wasn't. And my understanding is that Matt Lepore, the current Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission State Director, has done a really good job and actually hasn't approved any of those exceptions. But his ability to do so is so broad that we're going to end up having different commissioners or a different director as soon as we have a different governor, frankly. And at that point, it's anybody's guess how they're going to interpret that. So it does need to be further defined.
How would you address the property rights of mineral rights owners?
The property rights of mineral rights owners is the right to access those minerals so long as in giving due regard to the rights of the surface owner. And due regard is something that has been litigated. Essentially, the oil and gas industry believes, and in some cases, in some decisions, have the greater right. They are actually considered the superior right to the surface interest. That is, if there are conflicting interests and the surface owner wants to use the land in a certain way, but the mineral right can only use that surface, that mineral right's interest in getting those minerals through that surface trumps that surface owner's interest. Which seems a little backward because none of us live in the minerals. We all live on the surface. You would think that that would be what we'd be protecting. But in fact, it's probably due to excellent work by the oil and gas industry lobby and a number of attorneys over the years. It's the opposite.
Okay, I shall need the author's help here because I have worked on this word and it's full of possibilities. Okay, so the sentence, how many, and then there's a word, water contaminations occur. And it could be sanctioned, it could be sand tinted, it could be any number of words. So I shall need the author.
How many water contamination, documented water contamination?
Documented.
Yeah.
Woo!
Have occurred, yeah.
Documented, there it is. Thank you, I'm sorry, that's rare for me to, I read students' handwriting, I think I could have gotten that, so pardon me for that. Okay, so how many documented water contaminations occur?
As I mentioned, in thermogenic methane, there's only been 37 documented cases where gas from deep below the surface that they're trying to produce has actually gotten into groundwater. But groundwater is often polluted by other sources, and that's mostly spills on the surface. And that happens all the time. As one of the slides I showed, it's an average of 1 spill per day, and that was back in the day when they had to report. The reportable spill was 5 barrels. A barrel is roughly, 40 to 50 gallons, depending on whether you're British. So, and they also, it's all self-reported in the state of Colorado because we just don't have the inspectors out there enough, to be able to report that kind of thing. And we want them to self-report because we want to know problems ahead of time and know that they're cleaning them up. So the industry, I believe, I have every right to believe that, are pretty good at reporting those, and they report a lot of them. And also in that reporting, they report whether or not that contaminated water or whatever it was that discharged made it to groundwater or made it to surface water. And in about 40% of the cases in Weld County over the last 4 years, it has made it to groundwater. So says the oil and gas industry.
Okay.
So I hope that answers your question. It's about 365 a year.
What is on the Boulder ballot to protect people against oil and gas development?
Well, we've got one of the campaign leaders here on that very issue, and I am not as knowledgeable.
Asked you.
I have someone would talk about it, I'd like to.
Oh, well, I think we'll chat afterwards. There she is afterwards, so everyone would want to chat with you. Why don't you answer that, and then we'll just point you out. Wave your hand there. So there she is for anybody who wants to.
Yes, on 2H.
Well, there we are.
Yes, on 2H is
I think the question was what is on, rather than what to do with it. But maybe, okay.
And I'm not familiar with the particulars. I think it's a 5-year.
It's a 5-year
moratorium.
Based on the need to get public safety data, air quality data, to know yes or no is it safe.
And it's also waiting to see what happens with this Longmont suit, frankly. We know that the Longmont suit will have run its course, and we'll know whether or not local governments like the city of Boulder will have the ability to ban or greatly restrict or zone oil and gas development at that time.
Well, maybe continuing on that theme, what can be done on the federal or local or state level to curb corporate power? There is a big one for you. So.
Curb
it doesn't even say
power.
Exactly what corporations we're thinking of here, but I think you can guess that it's oil and gas there.
Well,
and I guess I would, this is not in the question, but you did talk about the difference between large operators and small operators, and that question doesn't spell that out, but it does seem like an interesting thing to address and what we're talking about when we talk about corporate power.
Yeah, there's a real difference in the state of Colorado, and I will just limit it to our topic rather than getting off.
No,
It-
you
'cause
don't
that
have to
could-
do
that could
any
go-
corporations.
They could go along a lot of different directions. In the state of Colorado, the larger operators are actually, in my experience, for the most part, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, the larger operators are the more responsible operators. And it's the smaller operators that maybe don't have the resources or doing things on a shoestring or don't have the experience. You know, a lot of these smaller operators, like the ones that are operating in Greeley, they don't do any of the drilling. They don't do any of the hydraulic fracturing. It's all done by these contractors, subcontractors. And they bring in teams and they get it done, and you know, there's not a lot of accountability there, unfortunately. And you know, in many cases, there's rushing to get it done as quickly as possible and saving, you know, money rather than doing it right and responsibly. And in some cases, like, again, I have to look at Synergy Corporation, which has announced that they're going to be drilling all these wells within the city limits of Greeley, and also announced at the same time when we're going to try to sell off for, you know, as much as we can within 5 years, you know, and buy a Greeley, you know, wash our hands of this. Those aren't the folks that you want drilling within your municipality, and unfortunately, they're the only ones that are interested. The larger operators don't want the horrible PR, you know, nightmare that comes with drilling within a municipality or possibly contaminating, you know, a school playground. So the problem is that in talking with these larger operators, they also have real concerns about these smaller ma and pa operators, fly-by-nights, that are giving them a bad name. And yet the lobby, you know, our friend Tish Shuley does such a good job keeping everybody together and united and speaking with one voice that you can never separate one from the other. They're all going to basically end up on the side of, you know, let's try to stop this regulation entirely, because, you know, that's what the kind of lowest common denominator corporation in their organization wants to do.
How does state versus local control issue, if you're thinking of just those two units, how does that change if you consider it in a context of federal versus state versus local control?
Yeah, that gets really fun in a preemption class. Essentially, what the Colorado Gas Conservation Commission does is surface issues. They're the ones that are permitting every surface location in the state, even on federal land. And there's certainly going to be some federal involvement through the Bureau of Land Management as well. But as far as requiring certain activities or protections for wildlife or some of the other things that we have in our state, the state is taking on the federal government and said, we're going to ignore, or we're going to read federal preemption differently and force you to follow our regulations. Which is interesting because, you know, when the situation is reversed and the state is in the position of having the regulations and the local governments are the ones that say, hey, we want to add some regulations, you know, the state isn't willing to do that. So the state really wants it both ways. They want to be able to tell the feds what to do, and they want to be able to tell the local governments what to do.
Is local control good if locals want oil and gas development?
That is an excellent question. And I haven't experienced one area that would want oil and gas development at the level of what we're seeing in Greeley. In fact, I was visiting with Alan Salazar and Doug Young, who are senior policy people for the Hickenlooper administration. And we were pleading with them to get involved in this case of 67 wells, you know, right next to an elementary school. And they looked at each other and they were just astonished. Their jaws dropped open. They said, nobody wants that. And he's right. There's not one person that wants it except for the one, you know, CEO of Synergy Oil and Gas. Nobody, that we have 100% agreement. And in fact, I would love to have local control because we would see a real change in the positions of the Greeley City Council. Of Weld County Commissioners ultimately would want some restrictions on oil and gas development. You know, even our 51st state would look at, if they had the power, would say, we don't think that drilling next to elementary schools is a good idea. So we saw that in Grand Junction, where a very almost united city council said, we're not going to protect our watershed, and the citizens spoke, and that local government, because they're more accessible to the people, said, yes, we will protect our watershed. Yes, we will stand with our communities in protecting this watershed. That's why these decisions need to be made at a local level, because there's more common sense, then there's more humanity at the local level, rather than having it all be done by engineers who say to themselves, wow, that's a clever and ingenious idea. Let's use a nuclear bomb. Those decisions don't work out for the locals, and so it should be made at the local level.
Do you see an expansion of converting methane to electricity from abandoned coal mines, and what regulations are presently in place? And we had a really nice event in honor of Randy Udall at Aspen, where his work at getting the Holy Cross utility to do this with him, and the harvesting of methane from coal mines. So this is a Randy Udall sort of question.
It's an excellent Randy Udall question. And I'm not up on the latest on this. My understanding is that there's certainly a lot of oil and gas that is gas that is being wasted, more or less, above coal mines, because there's not infrastructure to bring it to market. And so ultimately what ends up happening is, instead of venting it, they flare it or put it in an incinerator, as I mentioned, and ensure that it's completely combusted. And that is certainly better than having raw methane introduced into our environment. We haven't figured out incentives enough, except in certain instances. We haven't legislated incentives to get that into a pipeline into market, because it's just too expensive.
Communities such as Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Fort Worth, Texas have strong local ordinances for oil and gas. Why is it so difficult for Colorado to have a similar relationship with the oil and gas industry?
I don't think that it would be difficult. I think that, in fact, once the city governments had the ability to regulate the oil and gas industry, or at least to zone it, the basics of zoning, not getting into in-depth regulations, but just basic zoning is separating uses. A residential use from an industrial use, which we all accept, and every city in Colorado, except a few in Delta County, would do that. So I think that if we were to give city governments, local governments, even county governments, some more ability to zone oil and gas development, there would be more of a relationship with that community. The oil and gas industry would be more of a partner in coming up with regulations. And ultimately, I think that there would be better oil and gas development within our communities. It wouldn't go away. Certainly it wouldn't go away. There's too much money at stake, and there's too many jobs at stake, and there's going to be a balance there. But right now the balance is tipped, because they don't have to even talk to the local governments. They don't have any need to, because all the decisions are being made at the state level. So again, we're going to have better decisions and more balanced development if we bring these decisions into the local government.
Is there an element in communities that use natural gas for their own purposes and yet limit its production in their proximity? Is that dumping it onto rural areas, displacing it onto rural areas in a way that should take a little bit more thought, or is...
No, that's a good question. I think so. I think it does. And I know that's okay, because we live in cities, and that's the way we've decided to design our communities, is around these municipalities, and that's the way that it makes most sense. Otherwise, we've got urban sprawl everywhere, and everybody's living in, 2 acres, and that doesn't work, for all the efficiency and transportation and everything else. We decided that we want to live in cities, and we should live in cities, and those cities should be for living and for businesses and for some industry, certainly, but not that oil and gas industry everywhere in all those areas. So yeah, I would think that it is putting it off. And for the same reason that the questioner has, they're putting it to me, I put it to some of my fractivist friends. I'm not sure that I would agree with banning oil and gas development, throughout the state. In fact, I'd be opposed to it. I don't think that it makes sense for us to continue driving our cars and heating our homes and not bear some of the responsibility. We've got the oil and gas industry here, we've got the resources here, and we can do it responsibly. And if Colorado can't do it responsibly and can't show the world how to do it responsibly, who's going to? We've got a responsibility to do this right, rather than to just banning it and putting our problems off into Saudi Arabia or into Mexico or into Canada or Wyoming or all the other places that we're going to be importing our oil and gas. Clearly we need to move to a renewable future, but we're not going to do it overnight. There's going to be oil and gas. I'm leaving here in a car. Most of you will as well. So, let's figure out how to do it responsibly rather than just banning it entirely.
This is my question, but just to make sure that people here learn about it. What is welled air and water?
Welled air and water, that's an excellent question.
I thought you'd like that question.
Welled air and water is my favorite community group. They have only formed about 7 months ago in Wendy Hybee's living room. Wendy, can you just, yeah, thanks. And it was interesting because I went to visit with Wendy and her neighbors because they were being drilled on. That Midtown directional that I showed you is right in their neighborhood. And the oil and gas industry was knocking on the doors with landmen and saying, hey, we want to lease your property. And these are like less than, like they're a fifth of an acre. They're small lots. But everybody owned their mineral rights in that area. And so they're having to do the hard work of, drilling. I guess what happens in a municipality, you have to knock on every door and try to lease that land. And so they wanted to know what to do about it. And they heard that I was an oil and gas attorney, and we talked about what kind of lease was being offered and whether or not they wanted to work together as a community and as a neighborhood and try to do a joint lease that would be a protective lease. And I think one thing led to another, and Wendy and her, some of the people at that meeting ended up doing their own door knocking and just taking the temperature of the community as to what they should do, whether they should lease together and try to get the best lease they could that would be protective of their air and water. And the more people they talked to, the more they realized this just didn't happen at all. And they formed an organization to, in a sense, bring some balance to the discussion in a really unbalanced environment. Greeley doesn't have a lot of environmental organizations that are very active, as you can imagine. Weld County is very hostile to conservation issues. And yet, this is now a new voice in Weld County, kind of in the middle of most of the oil and gas development in the state that is really refreshing and doing some great work.
Do you oppose horizontal drilling to produce gas under cities when the wellhead is outside the city?
I think that I would not be absolutely opposed to that. There is only one instance that I'm aware of where hydraulic fracturing has actually caused water contamination, and that is in Wyoming. And it was a very different type case, and they were actually doing that hydraulic fracturing right under the water producing zone, rather than what we have here in the Niobrara, where there are a good mile of rock between where we get our water and where we're producing that Niobrara oil from. So I wouldn't have a problem with it, so long as it wasn't in a growth area or open space. And clearly we want to make sure that it's also as far away from any homes as possible. I'm not just concerned about the municipalities, I'm also concerned about any homes in rural areas as well.
I'm going to ask, this is just one more from me and then the last question. Is there any chance you romanticize local control and community decision making? And I ask that. I grew up in a small town and we did not do well at harmony. in that town. And I'm just wondering if there's any way in which you might want to say that, I guess I said you have visions, and I just wonder if some of your visions about the local folk coming together and charting their future.
Oh, it happens in generations of decisions and in generations of ballot measures. I mean, you know, there would have to be a clean sweep of the folks that are in Greeley right now, you know, to almost clean sweep. We have 2 people that voted for us in the last time we were in front of the Greeley City Council, but you know, that's what elections are for, and that's what our democracy is for stating our positions and for voting on those positions and putting people in power that reflect our own values and our own views. And ultimately, even Weld County would be moderate in their views around oil and gas. It wouldn't be all go oil and gas. It would be, we need to do this responsibly. They've never once said that. They've been just 100% for oil and gas. And if you were to all of a sudden give them the responsibility of making decisions around oil and gas, they would have to be a lot more nuanced in their views.
Okay, last question. What local control issues do you consider the most important to maintaining health and safety of a community? Setbacks, baseline water sampling, impact fees, something else?
For me, it's setbacks. I think that we need to ensure that there is a separation between uses. I don't think anybody should be in an industrial area. I've got a friend, Dee Hoffmeister, who lives in Garfield County, who had a well fire that was not more than 400 feet from her home. And it was such a hot fire that she went onto her porch and they had to retreat back into the house because it was just burning hot to them, you know, scorching their skin. Had it been any closer than 400 feet, it would have burned their house. Now, you know, that's an extreme example, but again, it's an industrial facility and industrial accidents happen. We need to make sure that they're far enough away from our residential areas or any home or business that they're not going to cause that kind of harm.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our speakers.